The crash wasn't dramatic. No explosions, no heroic last-second maneuvers, just 3 vessels limping into an unplanned gravity, well, because someone, somewhere in the navigation chain, had fed incorrect coordinates into a jump calculator. The result was 3 separate ships, each following slightly different trajectories, all ending up scattered across the surface of TK 371, a barren moon that catalogues described as geologically stable and devoid of interest. The catalogues were correct on both counts, which made it an exceptionally poor place to be stranded. The Velkin trade hauler had come down hardest, ploughing a furrow through crystalline dust before its stabilizers caught and prevented a complete tumble. 6 crew members, all reptilian, all cold-blooded, all already beginning to feel the temperature drop as their ship's failing power systems struggled to maintain heat. The Sesorth scientific survey vessel had managed a more controlled descent, its 4 insectoid crew members clicking in distressed harmonics as they assessed the damage to their sensor arrays and noted, with growing alarm, that the chemical leak in cargo had contaminated their entire food supply. The human salvage tug, really more of a glorified cargo hauler with delusions of adequacy, had skidded sideways, lost a landing strut, and settled at an angle that would make every subsequent movement inside the ship an exercise in fighting gravity. From this 3rd vessel emerged Darren Culliver, solo operator, currently experiencing the particular flavor of frustration reserved for professionals who have just watched a milk run turn into a survival situation through absolutely no fault of their own. He stood on the hull plating for a moment, surveyed the 2 other wrecks, noted the moon's utterly barren landscape of grey dust and darker grey rock, and sighed the sigh of a man adding this incident to a mental list titled "Reasons I Should Have Stayed Terrestrial." The moon's atmosphere was technically present in the same way that a politician's promise is technically language, there in form, absent in substance. Temperatures were already dropping as the distant sun slipped toward the horizon. Darren checked his suit's readout, -80 degrees Celsius and falling. Nighttime would bring -140 degrees Celsius, which was the kind of cold that didn't kill you dramatically, but simply shut down biological processes with bureaucratic efficiency. He began pulling equipment from his damaged tug with methodical precision. Emergency thermal blanket, portable power cell, tool kit, ration packs, water recycler, cracked but possibly salvageable. The hull fragment that had been his kitchen table, now liberated from its moorings. As he worked, he became aware of being watched. The alien crews had convened in the space between the wrecks, clearly attempting to formulate a plan. Darren could see the body language even across species barriers, gestures of distress, confusion, the universal posture of people realizing their situation is significantly worse than initially assessed. The Velkin captain, Thesic, approached first. His scales had already dulled slightly, the beginning of cold-induced torpor. "Human, your vessel is communication functional." "Negative," Darren replied, not looking up from his inventory. "Primary array sheared off during landing." "You? Compromised." The Sesorth report, "Similar damage. We have attempted to coordinate emergency protocols." Thesic paused. "Our thermal shelters are designed for short-term use. Power reserves will sustain us perhaps 3 standard days. After that," he didn't need to finish. "After that, the Velkin would slow, then stop, then freeze. The Sesorth would burn through their metabolic reserves and starve. Even Darren, with his mammalian temperature regulation, would eventually succumb to exposure once his suit's power depleted." "Right," Darren said. He looked at the scattered wreckage, the utterly barren landscape, the darkening sky. Then he looked at the pile of equipment he'd extracted. "Anyone mind if I borrow some of your broken stuff?" The question was met with the confused silence of beings who couldn't quite pass the logic. What could one human possibly accomplish that their combined engineering knowledge, their sophisticated emergency protocols, their proper training couldn't solve? Darren took the silence as permission and started walking toward the Velkin hauler, dragging a section of his own hull plating behind him. The narrator, observing this scene with the detached amusement of someone not currently freezing on a dead moon, might note that humans have a peculiar relationship with garbage. Where other species see failed systems and depleted resources, humans see components, raw materials, potential. It's the mindset of a species that spent its formative millennia turning rocks into tools and dead plants into fire. Darren spent the next hour collecting what the others had already mentally categorized as useless: cracked fuel cells, severed wiring, hull fragments bent at odd angles, even the decorative heat lamps the Velkin had installed in their rest quarters for ambiance. He dragged it all to a relatively flat area near the crash sites and began sorting with the focus of someone who had done similar tasks before under similarly unfortunate circumstances. The Sesoth leader, identified by the designation Myrick 4, approached with the careful steps of someone trying to understand an alien thought process. Human Culliver. What are you constructing? Heat source, Darren replied. Not looking up. He was stripping wire from a damaged control panel with a blade from his toolkit. Our thermal shelters provide heat. For 3 days, I'm looking at something more sustainable. The moon's resources are negligible. There is no combustible material, no geothermal activity, there's magnesium. Darren interrupted. He held up a handful of the crystalline dust. About 18% of this surface material, if I'm reading my scanner right, burns hot when you get it started properly. Myrick 4's antenna twitched in what might have been skepticism. The energy required to ignite magnesium in this atmosphere, yeah, it's a pain. That's why we're going to cheat. Darren had extracted a fuel cell from his tug, cracked casing, leaking but still holding a charge. He was building a framework around it using hull fragments, creating what appeared to be a chamber, controlled burn, small oxygen feed from damaged life support systems. Use the fuel cell's remaining charge to generate initial ignition heat. Once the magnesium catches, it sustains itself long enough to be useful. He worked with the efficiency of someone following a mental checklist developed through experience rather than training manuals. The combustion chamber took shape. A crude box with an air intake, a fuel feed, and a heat exhaust carefully angled to radiate outward. It was, the narrator would observe, embarrassingly primitive by the standards of spacefaring civilizations. It was also exactly what the situation required. 2 hours after he'd started, Darren had fire. Actual combustion, with visible flames and radiated heat, a phenomenon the Velkin understood theoretically, having read about it in anthropological studies, and which the Sesoth found actively disturbing, their evolutionary history having taught them that uncontrolled oxidation meant danger. But there it was, a sustained burn producing warmth in a 4-meter radius, fed by crystalline dust and carefully rationed oxygen. Thesic's crew gravitated toward it instinctively, their cold blood responding to heat with biological imperative. They stood in a semicircle, scales gradually brightening as their metabolic processes normalized. Darren monitored the burn rate, adjusting the oxygen flow with a valve he'd fashioned from what had been, until recently, part of someone's acceleration chair. It's not efficient, he admitted. We'll need to keep feeding it, and the oxygen won't last forever, but it buys time. How did you know this would work? Thesic asked, his voice stronger now, warmed. Darren shrugged. Chemistry, Plus, camping. Camping, Myrick 4 repeated, as though testing the word. Recreational survival activity. Humans do it for fun sometimes. Darren added more dust to the burn chamber. This is like camping, but worse. Heat alone wouldn't save them. The moon's surface temperature fluctuations were severe enough that exposure meant death regardless of how close you stood to a flame. The alien crews had their emergency shelters, inflatable structures with good insulation but terrible longevity, powered by cells that were already showing charge depletion. Temporary solutions to a problem that was looking increasingly permanent. Darren surveyed the wreckage field with the assessing eye of someone who had, at various points in his career, built workshops in cargo bays, living quarters in storage containers, and once, memorably, a functional shower using nothing but a water tank and gravity. The crash site had, if nothing else, raw materials. He started dragging the largest intact hull plates toward a shallow depression in the crystalline surface. The work was slow in the bulky survival suit, but methodical. Piece by piece, a structure began to take shape. Myrick 9, one of the Sessorth engineers, approached. "What is your objective?" "Making a roof," Darren replied, maneuvering a plate into position. "The emergency shelters provide adequate enclosure. For now, what happens when the power runs out?" He secured the plate using support struts he'd salvaged from his tug's cargo bay. "This doesn't need power, just physics." What followed was a process that would have seemed absurdly crude to any civilization that had mastered climate-controlled habitats and force field barriers. Darren created a framework using support struts from all three vessels, carefully testing weight distribution and stress points. He angled hull plates to create a windbreak and positioned them to reflect heat inward from the burn chamber. Then, in a move that genuinely baffled the Velkin, he began excavating regolith and partially burying the structure's base. "You're digging?" Sessic, the younger Velkin crew member, couldn't hide his confusion. "Insulation," Darren explained, scooping more of the crystalline dust against the base. "Ground temperature is cold, but it's stable. Surface temperature swings 90 degrees between day and night. Underground, even just a meter down, it barely changes. We use the ground as a thermal buffer." The narrator might observe that humans spent tens of thousands of years living in caves and crude structures before they ever considered space travel. This knowledge doesn't vanish just because you can build a starship. It simply waits, dormant, until circumstances make it relevant again. Darren insulated gaps between hull plates with shredded material from damaged ship systems. He created an airlock of sorts using flexible ducting and emergency seal foam, maintaining atmospheric integrity while allowing entry and exit. The structure was ugly, asymmetrical, and looked like exactly what it was: debris forced into functionality. It was also the difference between survival and death. When he finished, the combined crews could fit inside with the heat source positioned near the center. Temperatures stabilized at -12 degrees Celsius. Cold, certainly, but survivable with suits. The Velkin stopped the sluggish movements of torpor. The Sessorth ceased their anxious clicking. "It's not comfortable," Darren admitted, checking the seal on the makeshift airlock, but comfort wasn't really the design priority. Thesic ran a clawed hand along one of the hull plates, feeling the warmth radiating from inside. "We would not have considered this approach. Our emergency protocols focus on maintaining ship systems, rationing power, awaiting rescue. Those are good protocols," Darren said, "assuming rescue comes quickly. And if it does not, then you need a backup plan." He stepped inside the shelter, gesturing for the others to follow. "This is the backup plan." The next crisis announced itself through the distinctive sound of Sesorth digestive distress, a clicking, chittering noise that Mirik 4 tried to suppress but couldn't entirely hide. The contaminated food stores weren't just inedible, they were becoming a psychological burden as the crew's metabolic needs went unmet. The Velkin had nutrient paste, but it was formulated specifically for their biology, protein chains human and Sesorth digestive systems couldn't process. Darren's own supplies consisted of standard human rations designed for solo operation, enough to keep one person alive for perhaps 5 days if he stretched it. He didn't offer to share, which might have seemed callous until one did the math, and realized that dividing his rations 11 ways would simply mean everyone starving slightly more slowly. Instead, he asked questions. What contaminated the Sesorth supplies? He asked Mirik 4. Chemical leak. Coolant from a damaged thermal regulator breached the storage compartment. What kind of coolant? Glycol-based compound. Standard industrial specification. Darren nodded slowly. And you determined the food was completely contaminated. The liquid penetrated all storage containers. We cannot separate the contaminate from nutrition sources. Can I see it? Mirik 4's antennae angled in confusion, but led him to the Sesorth vessel. The contaminated storage area was exactly as described. Nutrition blocks floating in a viscous greenish liquid. The smell, even through his suit's filters, was deeply unpleasant. The narrator would note that while most species have evolved past the need to personally understand their food sources, relying instead on sophisticated supply chains and processing facilities, humans remain disturbingly connected to the process of turning raw materials into meals. It's a quirk of evolution. A species that spent significant time as both hunter and scavenger develops certain instincts about what might still be edible. Darren spent an hour sorting through the mess. He separated solid components from liquid, setting some nutrition blocks aside, discarding others. Then he did something that made Mirik 4's entire thorax shudder in revulsion. He removed his glove, scraped a tiny amount of residue from a block, and tasted it. Human culliver, that substance is toxic. Not great, Darren interrupted, spitting and wiping his mouth. But the protein matrix is intact. The coolant didn't penetrate the cellular structure, it's surface contamination mostly. The chemical analysis indicated, your analysis probably checked for presence of contaminant, right? Not penetration depth. He held up one of the blocks. These are dense. Designed to survive your ship's storage conditions. The glycol coated them, sure, but it didn't soak through. We can save most of this. What followed was a slow, painstaking process that demonstrated why humans had developed such elaborate cooking traditions. Using heat from his burn chamber and a makeshift distillation setup cobbled together from a Velkin water recycler and various tubes, Darren began extracting the contaminated liquid. The nutrition blocks were heated to temperatures that broke down the glycol's molecular structure while leaving the protein matrix intact. The process was inefficient, perhaps 60% yield if they were lucky, but 60% of something was infinitely better than 100% of nothing. It took hours. The other crews watched with varying degrees of fascination and concern as this human essentially decontaminated their food supply through applied heat and patience. Where did you learn this process? Mirik 9 asked. I didn't, Darren admitted, monitoring the temperature carefully. I'm adapting 3 or 4 different techniques. Water purification, food preservation, basic chemistry. Humans used to have to do this kind of thing regularly, make safe what nature provided unsafe. The first batch finished processing. Darren tested it again. Another taste that made the Sesorth flinch. Then he nodded. It'll keep you alive. Won't taste good, but survival rarely does. Water presented its own challenge, though one with a more straightforward solution. The permafrost beneath TK-371's surface contained ice, vast quantities of it, frozen solid since the moon's formation. Darren showed them how to excavate it, careful digging to avoid collapse, extraction of chunks, transport to the shelter. Then came melting, which they achieved by placing ice near the heat source in salvaged containers. The resulting water was filtered through layered fabric torn from seat covers and emergency blankets, removing particulate matter and any crystalline residue. It was labor-intensive. It was slow. It worked. This seems extraordinarily inefficient, Myrick 9 observed, watching Darren filter water for the third time. Compared to a ship's recycling system. Absolutely, Darren agreed. But those need power, which we're running out of. This just needs time and effort, which we currently have in surplus. By the third day, something unexpected had emerged from the desperation and improvisation, a routine. It wasn't formal, wasn't written down anywhere, but it existed as surely as the shelter they'd built and the heat that kept them warm. Darren had established watch rotations to monitor the burn chamber. Someone needed to maintain oxygen flow and add fuel every few hours. He'd rationed the reclaimed food into portions that would sustain the Sesorth until rescue arrived, assuming rescue arrived within a reasonable time frame. He'd created a maintenance schedule for the shelter, checking seals, reinforcing weak points, clearing dust accumulation that could interfere with the heat reflection system. The alien crews, initially resistant to taking direction from a single human, and a civilian salvage operator at that, had settled into the pattern because it demonstrably worked. The Velkin were warm, the Sesorth were fed, everyone had water. These basic facts overrode any hesitation about hierarchy or protocol. Darren taught Thesic how to maintain the burn chamber's oxygen flow, demonstrating the valve adjustments that kept combustion steady without wasting their limited supply. He showed Myrick 9 how to identify structurally sound hull sections versus weakened ones, skills applicable to reinforcing the shelter as needed. He demonstrated to Sesic the proper technique for excavating ice without causing a collapse that could bury the digger under tons of frozen regolith. None of this was flashy. There were no dramatic moments of inspiration, no sudden breakthroughs. It was patient, methodical problem-solving, observation of the environment, experimentation with available materials, adaptation of old solutions to new problems. The narrator might note the irony, 11 sophisticated spacefaring individuals being kept alive by techniques humans developed before written language. Fire-making, shelter building, water purification. The fundamental technologies of survival, preserved through cultural transmission across millennia because they remained useful even when, perhaps especially when, more advanced systems failed. But the crews began contributing their own knowledge once the foundation was stable. Myrick 9's understanding of structural efficiency led to improvements in the shelter's design, better weight distribution, more effective heat retention. Thesic's chemical expertise helped optimize the fuel mixture for the burn chamber, extending their oxygen supply by nearly 40%. Even Sesic, young and inexperienced, proved adept at organizing the supply inventory, ensuring nothing was wasted or forgotten. What emerged was collaboration, born not from hierarchical command structures or formal protocols, but from the simple fact that Darren had created the foundation upon which they could all survive, and survival was a goal everyone shared. On day 9, sensors detected an approaching vessel. The The distress signal from the Sessuth ship's backup system, damaged but still functional, had finally reached a relay station. Help was coming. The rescue team arrived, expecting to find desperate survivors in failing emergency shelters, rationing their last resources, possibly already suffering from exposure or starvation. Instead, they found a functioning camp with a stable heat source, organized food and water distribution, and a structure that, while aesthetically unfortunate, had clearly been maintained and improved over days of habitation. The rescued crews were in good health. Tired, certainly, no one slept well at -12°C in a makeshift shelter on a dead moon, but alive, functional, and with resources that would have sustained them for at least another week if necessary. As they boarded the rescue vessel and shed their survival suits in the blessed warmth of climate-controlled quarters, Thesic approached Darren. "Human Culliver, I must ask, where did you receive training for these survival techniques?" Darren shrugged, accepting a water bulb from one of the rescue crew. "Summer camp when I was a kid. Scout training in my teens. A few bad vacations where things didn't go according to plan." He sipped the water, savoring the fact that he hadn't needed to excavate, melt and filter it himself. Humans tend to teach this stuff pretty universally. Never know when you might need it. Thesic didn't understand. His species had no equivalent cultural practices, no tradition of recreational survival skills, but he nodded respectfully. Myrick 4 settled into an acceleration couch nearby, antennae relaxing for the first time in days. Humans seem to carry their entire evolutionary history with them, the Sessuth observed, accessible when needed, even across vast technological advancement. Darren considered this. "We just remember what worked," he said finally. "Fire kept us warm before we had climate control. Shelter protected us before we had ships. Water purification kept us alive before we had recyclers. The technology changes, but the problems stay pretty similar." The rescue ship's engines powered up, preparing for departure from TK-371's gravity well. Through the viewport, Darren could see the camp they were leaving behind, the crude shelter with its patchwork hull plating, the burn chamber still glowing faintly, the excavation sites where they dug for ice. It looked like a monument to desperation, which in many ways it was. But it also looked like something else. Proof that civilization was just a thin layer over survival, and humans had never quite forgotten what lay beneath. The sophisticated systems that allowed them to cross between stars were wonderful when they worked, but when they failed, and they always eventually failed, there was something to be said for knowing how to make fire with broken equipment and chemical dust, how to build walls from debris, how to turn contaminated supplies into sustenance through nothing more complicated than heat and patience. The narrator, observing this scene with the amused detachment of someone who had watched the entire improbable affair unfold, might reflect that other species saw humanity's retention of primitive skills as quaint at best, vestigial at worst. But there was a difference between abandoning old knowledge and building upon it, between forgetting survival and transcending it. Humans, it seemed, preferred to keep their options open. The rescue ship broke orbit, leaving TK-371 behind. On the moon's surface, the makeshift camp still stood, still burning, still providing warmth to the barren landscape, a small defiant flame against the cold indifference of the void. It would burn for days yet, fueled by magnesium dust and human stubbornness, a reminder that sometimes the most advanced solution was remembering what worked 10,000 years ago and having the good sense to use it again.